I want to suggest that perhaps there's nothing more unsettling than a home break-in. There's something about taking the place that is your shelter and your home and seeing it desecrated, seeing the place that you're like, this is where I'm safe, and seeing, well, maybe I'm not so safe. Your stuff is left where it should be, and now it's been thrown apart, and you know your stuff is not safe where you have it anymore. There is a story, know it somewhat, based on true individuals. So the names have been changed for the sake of secrecy. But it's called the Mark and Beatrice. Mark and Beatrice were husband and wife, and they had a break-in during their house. And they decided they needed a dog to bring them some safety. A dog to watch over their home. And so they began doing research. They went to the pound. They are checking things. And one day Beatrice comes up and says, "Oh, Mark, wouldn't this dog be so just wonderful? It's adorable. I've always wanted one like this." And she holds up a little 6-pound chihuahua in front of him. Mark, in response, smiled lovingly at his wife and said, "Honey, I know that's a cute dog, but I don't think that's what we need right now. We want a dog for security, not for cuteness. We need a dog that will protect you, that will make you feel safe. We need a stronger dog." Perhaps at times we need to remember how we need strength and not just cuteness. And when it comes to Christmas, we often picture the adorable baby Jesus in the manger. And we think of that cute little baby just as we see a cute little baby girl having come into our church right now. You're like, "Oh, that's so adorable." But our problems need much bigger than just a cute little baby Jesus. We have family members dying. We have sleepless nights with babies crying. We have concerns about how we are going to pay the bills. The political conflicts still spilling out, right? We're going into regular life. You have family members refusing to do so. And man, I just talk about the own struggle of sin in my own life, where it seems like this, I thought I beat this, and it's here again. When we get to Christmas, we need to not just remember little baby Jesus in the manger. We also need to remember where he was from and where he is now, and how he's actually, according to Revelation 1, strong enough to handle all of your problems. Right? Who Jesus is now talking about. Next week, we're going to get into what Jesus is doing for us right now. And then on the 22nd, as we get ready to Christmas, we're going to talk about just the wisdom of worshiping Jesus in our festivals. So we are in the book of Revelation, chapter 1. Let me remind you, because Revelation was written by John, the apostle, the one who Jesus loved. He's the same guy who wrote the Gospel of John and the epistles of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John. And he is an old man at this point. She's a great example of a guy who continued to serve Jesus until his very end. In old age, he never retired until he was home with the Lord. And right now, he's on this little island of Patmos. He has been sent into exile. Often it is the church tradition is that before he was sent here, he was literally tarred and feathered, thrown in. He didn't die, and so they sent him here. And so he's on this small island southwest coast of Asia Minor. According to verse 9, it's because of the word of God and the testimony of Jesus. These are not good times for John or for the church. He's here because he preached the truth, and the Roman Empire didn't like that, and so they punished him and sent him away so he couldn't cause any more problems. It is on the Lord's Day, so it's a Sunday. He's worshiping the Lord, even though he's separated from other Christians, and he then is given a vision as an apostle who's setting the foundation of our faith, according to Ephesians 4. He's given this last book of the Bible, and he is told to write a message to the 7 churches, and therefore sends a message to them and to all of us ever since. And we could get into all the things of Revelation, talking about the future, but I want us to just look at what he sees about who Jesus is. And I want to try and suggest that the true form of Jesus should bring us both fear and hope. When John sees Jesus, he receives both fear and hope. And so when we understand and we believe what Jesus is actually like, we will have fear and hope. So that's the outline. Just two parts, fear and hope, but we're going to break it down as we go through it a little bit more. First part, you should fear Jesus because he is powerfully intimidating. Like, Jesus is crazy in this image here, and it's intimidating, rightfully so. We're going to break that down to see as the baby Jesus is revealed as he really is in verse 13 and 15. He turns to hear that voice he just heard, and what does he see? In the middle of the lampstands, I saw one like a son of man, clothed in a robe reaching to the feet, and girded across his chest with a golden sash. His head and his hair were white wool, like snow. His eyes were like flaming fire. His feet were like burnished bronze when it was made to glow in a furnace. And his voice was like the sound of many waters. This is an amazing description. Verse 13, he says, Jesus was one like the Son of Man. Right? And picture you're John, and you hear this voice, and you turn around to look at that voice, and you see 7 lampstands. Most menorahs would have 7 lights on them. So we're looking at 49 candles glowing, and in the midst of them stands a figure. Right? And so he's looking at these lights. There's a figure. What a sight. And he says he's like. Notice how many times he says like. These are similes. Part way of saying, how do I describe this? He's not saying it is this. He's saying it's like this because I can't even find the words to describe what he really is. It's too amazing. And he says, this is the Son of Man, which you will recall was Jesus' favorite term for himself. For example, in John 9:35 through 38, Jesus heard that they had cast him out, and having found him, he said, "Do you believe in the Son of Man?" The healed man, answered, "And who is he, sir, that I might believe in him?" Jesus said, "You have seen him, and it is he who is speaking to you." The man said, "Lord, I believe," and he worshiped him. John 9:35 through 38. We know Jesus is still human. He's still in human flesh, even today, glorified in heaven, because in Colossians chapter 2, verse 9, it says, "The fullness of deity dwells in Jesus in bodily form." Colossians 2:9 tells us that Jesus has the fullness of deity in a body. He's human still. But he's more than just that. He is the glorified God-man. Jesus did not shed his human nature when he ascended, but I would argue the title, and most of the title, Son of Man, isn't actually referring to the fact that he is man, even though he is. It's referencing an old prophecy. We're going to jump back and forth between Daniel and here for a little bit, so maybe you want to hold your finger here, go to Daniel chapter 7, as we see some of these prophecies, which are lining up exactly with what Jesus is like here. Daniel 7, verse 13 and 14. Daniel 7, 13 and 14. Look down in your Bibles as he says, "I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a Son of Man was coming. He came up to the Ancient of Days and was presented before him, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion which will not pass away, and his kingdom is one which will not be destroyed." Jesus is this promised one who will have everlasting dominion. And he's described as a priest in verse 13 of Revelation chapter 1, where he says, "This one is clothed in a robe reaching to his feet, girded across his chest with a golden sash." It's similar to the description of the priests in Exodus 28, verse 4. The sash is one of a high, exalted state. And remember, the description, he's more than just a man. Verses 14 and 15 says his head and his hair were white like wool, like snow. His feet were like burnished bronze, which had been made to glow in the furnace. His voice was the sound of many waters. Daniel 7, verse 9, as said, we can jump back. I kept looking until the thrones were set up, and the Ancient of Days took his seat, and his vesture was like white snow, and the hair of his head like pure wool. His throne was ablaze with flames, and its wheels were a burning flame. God, the Ancient of Days, looks just like Jesus right now. His eyes, fire. Eyes that no sin can escape, purifying eyes. His feet like shining bronze, as if they were heated up, glowing. In Daniel chapter 10, verse 6, again, another prophecy about the same glorious one that he saw, just a few pages over, Daniel chapter 10, verse 6. He sees this man in verse 5 with a belt, whose waist is girded with a belt of pure gold of Uphaz. His body was like beryl. His face had the appearance of lightning. His eyes were like flaming torches. His arms and feet like the gleam of polished bronze. And the sound of his words like the sound of a tumult. Get that right. He is God in glory. His voice is like the roar of waters. It would have brought to mind the promises of Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 24, where it says, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, like the sound of an army. Jesus' voice is like the sound of an army, stronger. It is the glory of God. Jesus is no longer a cute little baby. He is glorified in power. This is the answer to his prayer. Remember, in the upper room, as he's praying with his disciples in John 17, he says to the Father, I glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. Now, Father, glorify me in your own presence with the glory that I had with you before the world existed. The vestiges of weakness, the rags that sat on Jesus, the humility that he took on is ripped away, only revealing who he truly is, the glorious God-man. And this would be surprising if we had just the image of baby Jesus. It's considered like the story of a small town where men have gone off to war to fight for their country. And you hear the story of a man who is coming back to town, who is a decorated warrior. He has given his life, he has risked his life. He didn't give it, he still has it. He's risked his life for the sake of others. He's been injured in battle. He has come back with great rewards. And it would be easy to think, the image is like, okay, yeah, like just that great, hometown quarterback, the strong man, the one that everyone liked. He would be the hero. But instead, it was, the insignificant and scrawny man, the unsurprising one that everyone thought would be like, oh yeah, who is he? This was the man who rescued people, who risked his own life. And you can picture the scene of ages gone past, standing by the train station when people would arrive by train. And here, getting off from the train, is that same young man, that little scrawny boy they all knew. But he wasn't scrawny anymore. He was bulging with muscles. His eyes had a confidence and a focus and an assurance like never before. This was a strong man. And in the same way, we must believe that Jesus is that strong man. Some of us, some of you need a bigger vision of Jesus. It's part of the reason why we've been doing this study on the attributes of God is that at times, let's be honest, we think of God as a wise old man giving advice. Or we think of Jesus as, a kind man who is giving us what we need in our times. But this description shows us that Jesus is God, And as we'll get here in a bit, God is terrifying. God's a bit scary because this is shocking. Yes, it offends people because Jesus doesn't just die for sins. Jesus defines what sin is. It's anything different from him. And so when we talk about Christmas, remember, we don't just tell the story of the baby Jesus. We tell the story of Revelation 19, when Jesus will come with strength to conquer all those who oppose him. This is the God. This is why it's worth following him, because he is strong. And since he is God, verse 16 tells us that Jesus has real authority. Revelation 1, verse 16. In his right hand are 7 stars, and out of his mouth came a sharp, two-edged sword, and his face was like the sun shining in its strength. Jesus has authority. In the ancient world, considering being on the right hand of someone was to have authority. That was the hand that held the scepter of authority. Often people were right-handed. They held swords in their right hand, or at least that was expected. And so the 7 stars are identified as the 7 angels of the 7 churches in Asia in verse 20. He has those in his hand. He controls them. Then out of his mouth comes a sharp, two-edged sword. Now, a lot of these things is trying to be descriptions and give their images. So I don't know if you necessarily say literally a sword is coming out of his mouth. But it's interesting is the word for sword is not the word for dagger or personal sword. This is the word for broadsword, a large weapon used in warfare. Think of it as the difference between having your own personal handgun that you carry around for your protection versus driving around in a tank. This is like the tank, right? This is not, oh yeah, and Jesus can defend himself. No, Jesus is going to war with this. And he will use it, right? Revelation 19:15. From his mouth comes a sharp sword with which to strike down the nations, and he will rule them with a rod of iron. He will tread the winepress of the fury of the wrath of God the Almighty. Revelation 19:15. The description finishes with the sun shining in all its brilliance. This is just a simile to describe. How do you describe it? It is like looking into the sun. Jesus' power, his authority, is blinding. According to a study by the University of Tennessee a few years ago, the sun releases an estimated 384.6 yottawatts. A yottawatt. A yottawatt is 10 to the 26, so it's 3.846 with 26 zeros after it. That's how much energy comes from the sun in light and radiation. That's a lot of power. They did this and said, if you could take just the sunlight hitting all of Texas. Texas is a pretty big state, but if you could just absorb all that energy, it could be converted to electricity. It would be 300 times the total power of every energy-producing plant in the world. Just Texas. If you could actually capture all the energy hitting Texas, it would be more than 300 times all the plants in the world. The only reason we survive is because the energy is spread out over a sphere of approximately 93 million miles. That energy separates. Jesus' appearance is like the power of the sun. And so currently, yes, some people are ignoring his glory, but that's only because he hasn't revealed himself yet. When Jesus reveals himself as he is, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. There will be no escaping his power, like there is no escaping the sun. And that blazing power should have an effect on us, should it not? It does on John, because we see in verse 17 that baby Jesus is revealed as awesome. in the ancient sense of awe-inspiring, full of awe. Look at verse 17. When I saw him, I fell at his feet like a dead man. So what does John do when he sees Jesus? He passes out like dead. The man who leaned on Jesus, right? Remember in the upper room, and there are all those questions, and it says that he leaned into his bosom. He felt so comfortable just coming closer to him. He was the disciple who Jesus loved. He was one of the three most intimate. He turns around, he sees Jesus, and he can't even stand in his presence. Just as Saul, the enemy of Christ, fell down when he saw the resurrected Jesus in a vision and became the Apostle Paul, John, the friend of Jesus, still falls down. He is awe-inspiring. He is awful in the old sense of full of awe. Compare this to how Jesus was on the first Christmas day. Philippians chapter 2. We looked at this a number of months ago. It says Jesus, Philippians 2:5, who though in the form of God did not account equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself, taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men, and being found in human form, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. This Jesus that John sees now became weak, a helpless little baby creature. It's sometimes helpful to think not just what he became, but what he left, what he willingly laid aside for a time. Existing in the form of God, he was independent, didn't need anything. He became dependent upon his mother and upon the world. He was unchangeable, the same yesterday, today, and forever, and he grew up. He had acne, like a junior higher does. He went from eternal, forever and ever, to having to grow and change. He became dependent in one spot. Jesus has appeared in the awesome form we read here in the Old Testament as well. The angel of Yahweh, the angel of the Lord, is identical to Yahweh, but is different. And so in the New Testament, we see the Father and the Son, both God. The only description here can be Jesus as God, and yet they're distinct. And so when Moses came face to face with God the Son, Exodus 3 verse 2, the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. Exodus 3 verse 6, and he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Exodus 3:6. Remember, before Jesus became a baby, he was fire. He was that burning bush. He was mighty, and he became human. So that in Luke 2 verse 7 we read, she gave birth to her firstborn son and wrapped him in swaddling cloths and laid him in a manger because there was no place for them in the inn. Jesus became humble, but he is presently and in the past terrifying. I think we could all agree becoming like dead, it would not be fun, right? Passing out and hitting the ground is not fun. There have been different studies, and there are actually different types of passing out. I didn't realize this. I just pulled up a study on it, that there's different reasons that people pass out for different things. One of them is because your heart doesn't pump enough blood to your brain, or it starts pumping abnormally, and so it just kind of squirts around, and then your brain just doesn't get enough and just shuts down, and you hit the ground. Think how, again, this disciple who knew Jesus so well in life gets a glimpse of the glorified Jesus, and his heart can't handle it, and he passes out in the midst of it. He was so comfortable as to lean on Jesus' bosom, and he goes crazy. His heart goes crazy. Jesus is almighty. He is awesome. He is a bit terrifying. And yet, we are called to remember on Christmas that he came and put all of that awe aside and wrapped himself in humility. Remember how much the world says, look out for number one, right? Look out for yourself. Worry about your glory and your needs, your legacy, your memory, your family, your expense account, whatever it is. Look out for number one. Philippians 2 says, remember that Jesus, who is glorious, who is this, became a servant. You have to put others first. To be a better husband or wife, you have to be a servant and humble. To be a better mother or father, you have to be a servant. To be a better friend, you have to be a servant. We learn from Christ that to be a servant does not mean to be nothing. It means to lay aside your strength and your needs for the sake of others. It is great power wrapped in humility. Jesus is that way. So think, again, as you go into holiday season, all the midst of everything, go, okay, not just what does it mean to follow Jesus, but if I'm to be like Jesus, how should I take all my strengths and all my abilities and all the things that's good about me and say, well, no, but what do I need to do to be humble for the sake of others? Now, Jesus is intensely powerful and scary in his resurrected form. But secondly, he doesn't just leave us terrified. Jesus should also move us to not fear because he is powerfully forgiving. Jesus should move us to not fear because he is powerfully forgiving. And he can forgive because that baby was eternal. Verse 17 and 18. Jesus can forgive because that baby was eternal. You look at the second part of verse 17. He placed his right hand on me, saying, do not be afraid. I am the first and the last and the living one. Think about this. Jesus' response is pretty astounding because you would think, what do we want, right? How do we usually want? Someone says, oh, don't be afraid. It's okay. Like, you're loved. Or don't be afraid. Like, I'm not that scary. I'm not going to hurt you. Or whatever you could think. It's something to make the situation calmer. No, Jesus doesn't do that. He says, oh, I'm the one who's always been. Jesus is actually saying, like, I am greater. This is God we're talking to here. I will blow your mind with how long-lasting I am. That's Jesus' response to a terrified John. He actually piles more reasons on for him to be intimidated and terrified, right? But he says, even though I am so big, don't be afraid. Again, compare this with John's description of the Lord God in chapter 1, verse 8, where he says, I am the Alpha and Omega, says the Lord God, who is and was and who is to come, the Almighty. Jesus is this one. Jesus is God. And Jesus is saying, you don't need to fear me because I am the same God. I am the one who's always living. I am the only God, and I have not changed. This baby is eternal. There's a lot of good Christmas songs out there that help us not just to enjoy the season, but to enjoy the Savior and be amazed by him. Chris Tomlin wrote a song called Winter Snow, or I'm actually not positive if he wrote it. He might have just popularized it, so don't get mad at me if I got that wrong. But in the song Winter Snow, he says, Jesus could have come like a mighty storm with all its strength of a hurricane. You could have come like a forest fire, but with the power of heaven in your flame. But you came like a winter snow, quiet and soft and slow, falling from the sky in the night to the earth below. Knowing Jesus' immensity makes us marvel, again, at his humility. That it makes us go, okay, the same Jesus that is high and lifted up, that is mighty, was the one who died on a cross. Every once in a while you hear people talk about how they see visions of God. You know, they get taken to heaven and they have a chat with Jesus. And usually it's pretty colloquial, just like, hey, buddy, how are you doing? And Jesus is like, I'm doing great. Let me tell you what God got planned for your life. When you see the real Jesus, if perhaps you saw a vision like John did of the real Jesus, your response would not be, hey, buddy. Your response would be to fall flat in your face as if dead. That you would be terrified. You need to have a fearful response to this Jesus. Because when you understand him as being the living one, the righteous one, the eternal one, your sin should make you worry. You should. You should be like, whoa, this is kind of crazy. I am not worthy of this one. This one should consume me for all the wrong I have done. We talked about the justice of God, the wrath of God this morning. They were just saying how often justice is not done in our world, and yet God does justice. And so if we see God, we, like Isaiah in Isaiah 6, will say, woe is me, for I am a man or woman of unclean lips. But the beauty is, you don't need to stay there, do you? You might fall over, as you should, but Jesus places his hand and says he uses all of that incredibly scary power to forgive a sinner like you. How cool is that? Like the unchanging, living one says, I'm going to forgive you because he died and rose. He can forgive because he is the eternal God who has all the power, and he can forgive because he is the one who died and rose. The baby Jesus came to die and rise again. Look at the last part of verse 18. I was dead, and behold, I am alive forevermore. I have the keys of death and Hades. Jesus came to earth. He lived as a baby, and he died on a cross, killed in our place. He paid the wage that we deserve for sins. The wage of sin is death. And then he didn't just stay dead. He was dead, and he is alive forevermore. He rose again, and with that, look, he has the keys of death and of Hades. You know the great thing about keys when it comes to doors is keys allows you to lock the door and unlock the door. If there is a prison, if you have the keys, what can you do? You can put someone in and you can let them out. Keys grant the holder authority. So while death is our great enemy that none of us can escape, you just read even today, there's always someone who they look for the fountain of youth in periods past. Now it's through different scientific techniques, both whether it is the idea, people are literally talking about immortality of your brain by uploading you into a computer, or by constant biohacking to make people live forever. And guess what? It's never going to work. We all will die. Death is our great enemy. We cannot outrun it. But who has the keys of death? Jesus. So he tells John, don't fear. He points to John's sins being forgiven. Jesus has the keys, that though he would be like dead, though he deserves death, as Jesus said, you can grieve with hope knowing that we will rise again. This is the glorious news for all those whose sins are forgiven. Jesus always came to die. The Christmas song, Who is he in yonder stall, says it well. Who is he on yonder tree, dies in grief and agony, At his feet we humbly fall. Crown him, Lord of all. Who is he that from the grave comes to heal and help and save? Who is he from his throne rules through all the world alone? Jesus came to die, and he came to rise, and he comes to control death itself. So, Christian, you don't need to be afraid, because Jesus took all his power, all his authority, and he used it to help you. You who've trusted in him. If you do not know Jesus, again, it's very easy in the midst of this, especially kids, as you grew up in church hearing about Jesus all the time, it is so easy to wonder what's so amazing about amazing grace? What's so amazing about God? And when you actually think, no, who he is revealed to be, it should terrify us, but it should also encourage us that he is worthy of being trusted. He's worthy because he is powerful and you can trust him. Non-Christians should be afraid of this all-powerful one because he does come to save, but he also comes to judge. He comes with the sword as well. But the solution is very simple. All you have to do is say, I'm not good enough, and I need forgiveness from this one. I am this one like John, dead, and I trust in the one who has the keys. In this time, I think we've gotten to see over all this that we should be terrified of Jesus. Jesus is strong. He is mighty. He is the all-powerful, consuming judge. But you don't need to fear Jesus because when he came to die, he raised again. He gives this newness of life. There are a lot of big problems in this world, right? There are difficulties in your life and difficulties in the lives of those around you. We are unusually blessed here in the 21st century America compared to people of the past or the people around the world even. And there is a wonderful poem that was turned into the song the poem was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. You might be familiar with it. It was written on Christmas Day in 1863. If you recall your calendar and your timeline, that is in the middle of the American Civil War. His wife had just been burned to death in a fire, his own face horribly injured. He was visiting his oldest son who had been injured and almost paralyzed by a bullet who passed through his left shoulder to his right. And while he's still alive, he could not move anything below the neck. And so he's reflecting on this on Christmas Day. And he writes, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and wild and sweet the words repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Right? Peace on earth, goodwill to men. But in despair I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said. For hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Right? He just noticed like this is mocking. This current world mocks this idea. But it goes on, then pealed the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. May we remember that Christmas morning, when Jesus was born, is just part one of the story. Now, was he actually born on Christmas morning? Not necessarily, but that's just part one. Part two is the resurrection. Jesus came and died and rose again. But may we not forget part three, the glorification. Jesus did not just rise. He is glorified. He is sitting in this way. And so might I suggest, as we think of the baby Jesus, we need one simple application. We are to become like him. In 1 John 3:2, he tells us about this overcoming power. Says, Beloved, now we are children of God, and it has not appeared as yet what we will be. We know that when he appears, we will be like him, because we will see him just as he is. What a glorious day. When we see this Jesus, not only will he say you are forgiven, one day he will make you morally without any sin. Intellectually, you will have no falsehood or error. Physically, you will have no weakness or imperfection, and you will be filled continually with the Holy Spirit. So what does John say I'm supposed to do about that right now? All right, what am I supposed to do right now? 1 John 3:3. Everyone who has this hope fixed on him purifies himself, just as Jesus is pure. Next week, we're going to look at Jesus' intercession for us and how we have hope that he will get us there. But we get to sing now how Jesus is providing the wonderful strength and help that we need. Jesus is good and faithful. He keeps us day and night. We can always run to Jesus, Jesus strong and kind. Your need is not to fix the world around you. Your need is not to bring God's work into completion. What do you, Christian, have to do? Trust that Jesus is strong and kind so that you will purify yourself. Focus on honoring him in all that you do and trust that he is strong enough to get you there.